The air in the sale barn was thick with the smells of sawdust, sweat, and money. But where Elara stood, holding the lead rope, it was still. The filly at her side, not yet a year old, was the calm centre of a storm of numbers. A coat was the colour of a thundercloud just before it breaks, and she watched the frantic bidding with an unnerving intelligence in her dark eyes, as if she were tallying the figures herself. Across the ring, Marcus Thorne, the man who owned the valley's largest stud farm and set the price of every good horse from here to the county line, was almost vibrating with fury. His face, usually ruddy with confidence, was pale and tight. The auctioneer's voice hammered down, a frantic rhythm against the rising tide of astonishment. 48,000, 48,500, 49. The number hung in the air, a record for a yearling in that county, a figure that was pure fantasy. Thorne's gaze was locked on Elara, a look of pure venom, as if she had personally stolen the breath from his lungs. Her hand did not tremble. It was easier to be still when you had nothing left to lose. 3 years earlier, on a bitter day in March, the whole valley had agreed that the grief of losing her husband had finally broken Elara's mind. They watched her buy a blind mare for $50 and pitied her straight into madness. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The auction that day had been a different affair entirely. It was the end of winter cull, a grim accounting of animals that hadn't earned their keep or had broken down over the hard months. The air was cold, smelling of wet wool and despair. Elara had gone not to buy, but to feel the familiar weight of the world, a world her husband David had loved, a world that now felt alien and sharp-edged without him. She stood at the back, a ghost in her own life, letting the noise wash over her. Then they brought in the mare. She was a pale roan, the colour of driftwood and fog, with the fine, delicate bones of a well-bred quarter horse, but her eyes were clouded, milky, and unfocused, staring into a private distance. She moved with a hesitant, stumbling grace, her head held high, ears swivelling constantly, trying to read the world by sound alone. The auctioneer didn't even bother with a grand introduction. Lot 47, he'd grunted. Mare, about 6 years old. Good lines, if you don't mind the view. Broke to ride before the accident, they say. What am I bid? Someone start me at 100 for the truck. Silence. The crowd shuffled. A man in front of Elara muttered to his friend, "Might as well be selling a 3-legged chair." The friend chuckled. Less useful. Can't even sit on it without it spooking at a shadow it can't see. She ain't seeing shadows, Bill, or anything else. The price dropped. 100 became 75, 75 became 50. The price of a few bags of feed. The price of hauling a body away. It was an insult, a dismissal. Marcus Thorne, standing near the front, arms crossed over his expensive shearling coat, let out a short, derisive laugh. He turned to the man beside him, his voice carrying in the cold air. Someone should put her out of her misery. It's a kindness. Something inside Elara, a thing that had been frozen since David's death 6 months prior, cracked. It wasn't pity for the horse. It was recognition. She saw the mare's stillness, the rigid set of her neck, the way she absorbed the insults and the laughter without flinching. She was an animal stripped of everything but her own stubborn heart, and still she stood. Elara knew that posture. She felt it in her own bones. The arithmetic of the crowd was simple. The mare was broken, therefore worthless. The cost to feed her through another season was greater than her value. It was the arithmetic of profit, but Elara was thinking of a different kind of math. The arithmetic of survival. The cost of one more winter alone versus the cost of having a purpose, no matter how small or hopeless. The cost of $50 against the weight of an empty barn. $50, the auctioneer called out, his voice flat with finality. Going once? Elara's hand went up, not high, just a small, determined gesture. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Heads turned. They saw her, the widow from the old Miller place up on the ridge, the woman who had been keeping to herself, wrapped in a grief so thick it was like a winter coat. They didn't see a rancher making a calculated risk. They saw a broken woman buying a broken horse, the perfect, tragic symmetry. Thorne glanced back, his eyes sweeping over her with a look of bored condescension. He didn't see a competitor. He saw a charity case making a foolish, sentimental mistake. He gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture of dismissal that was more insulting than any word. Sold, the auctioneer said, banging his gavel with a sound of relief, to the lady in the back, for $50. The money, 2 worn 20s and a 10, felt impossibly light in her hand. As she walked to the pen to collect the mare, the man who had joked about the 3-legged chair tipped his hat with an exaggerated, pitying courtesy. Good on you, ma'am, he said, his tone dripping with the false warmth people use for the bereaved and the simple-minded. A good heart. Elara didn't answer. She knew it was easier for them to believe she had a good heart than to believe she might have good eyes. It was easier to call it charity than to consider it a plan. Being right, she was learning, was its own kind of reply. And her silence, as she took the lead rope, seemed to unnerve him more than any argument. The mare's head came up as Elara approached, her ears fixed on the sound of her new owner's quiet footsteps. She stood still, waiting. One person alone, one horse alone. For Elara, it was not an ending, it was a beginning. Bringing the mare home was an exercise in patience. Elara's ranch was small, just 80 acres of hard-won land, clinging to a ridge overlooking the valley. David had poured his life into it, and now it was just her and the mortgage. A weight that sat on her chest every morning. The community had expected her to sell, to pack up, and move back to town. To shrink her life back to a manageable size. But leaving felt like a second death, an erasure of the life they had built. So she stayed, enduring the casseroles and the sad knowing looks. Her stubbornness, she knew, grew best in poor conditions. The mare stumbled coming off the trailer, her body rigid with fear of the unknown. Elara didn't pull or force her, she just stood, holding the rope, letting the mare map the space around her with sound and smell. The scent of pine from the tree line, the gurgle of the creek at the bottom of the pasture, the feel of the cool spring air on her skin. For the first week, Elara led her on a rope around the perimeter of the main pasture, a 5-acre plot with good fences David had set deep and true. She walked the mare along the fence line, letting her nose and shoulder brush against the wire, teaching her the boundaries of her new world. She tied strips of cloth to the posts, things that would flutter and make a sound in the wind. She placed the water trough in the exact center, a fixed point in the darkness, and led the mare to it from every direction until she could walk to it, unguided, from any spot in the field. It was slow, methodical work. There was no glamour in it, just the patient repetition of movement, the quiet murmur of her own voice, the gradual, almost imperceptible uncoiling of the tension in the mare's body. The townspeople, when they drove by on the low road, would sometimes slow their trucks. They'd see Elara out in the field with the blind horse, walking in slow circles, and they'd shake their heads. Still lost in her grief, they'd say, pouring good effort after bad money. One afternoon, a week after the sale, a dusty truck pulled into her lane. It was Mr. Sorensen, a neighbour to the north. He was an old Norwegian who had ranched in the valley for 50 years, a man of few words and deeply calloused hands. He was one of the few who hadn't brought a casserole or offered empty platitudes. It simply appeared at her door the day after David's funeral, handed her a freshly sharpened axe and said, "Winter is long. Wood must be split." It was the most useful thing anyone had done. He got out of his truck and walked not to the house but to the fence line, where Elara was standing with the mare. He leaned his forearms on the top rail, his gaze assessing. He didn't look at the mare's clouded eyes. He looked at her legs, her chest, the straight line of her back. He watched as the mare, hearing his unfamiliar presence, took 2 careful steps sideways, placing her feet with absolute precision, never turning her back completely. "She has good bones," Sorensen said. His voice was gravelly, the accent of his home country still thick on his tongue. "And good ears." "She's learning the fences," Elara said. He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He watched for another long minute, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Most people rushed to fill a silence. Sorensen inhabited it. "In the old country," he said finally, his eyes on the distant mountains, "we have a saying. A smooth path teaches a horse nothing of its own feet." The words settled in the air. He wasn't talking about the mare, not just about the mare. He was talking about the treacherous ground of loss, the stumble and recovery, the way strength is built not by avoiding obstacles, but by navigating them. He saw the mare not as a broken thing, but as an animal that had been forced to develop other senses to a razor's edge. He saw Elara the same way. "You paid $50, he stated. It wasn't a question. News travelled fast. "Yes." Thorne laughed. "Yes." Sorensen grunted. "Thorne knows the price of a horse. He does not know its worth." He pushed himself off the fence. "The ground is hard here. Good. You'll make us strong." He gave a final approving nod and walked back to his truck without another word. That evening, as the sun went down and painted the valley in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Elara stood with the mare. The horse, unprompted, took a few steps, then turned and walked directly to the water trough, her movements no longer hesitant, but confident. She had learned her world. Mr. Sorensen's words echoed in Elara's mind. A smooth path teaches a horse nothing of its own feet. She ran a hand on the mare's strong neck. The path ahead was anything but smooth. That, she decided, was its greatest advantage. Summer arrived, painting the valley in greens and golds. The days grew long, filled with the hum of insects and the smell of warm earth. It was during that summer that the boy appeared. His name was Finn, and he belonged to the slovenly rental property that bordered Elara's land to the west, a place of peeling paint and rusted machinery. He was about 10, with a shock of unruly hair and the watchful, silent demeanor of a child who has learned that being invisible is a form of safety. He didn't announce himself. He just materialized at the edge of the pasture one afternoon, a thin figure half hidden by the tall grass, watching. Elara was mending a stretch of fence, the rhythmic work a kind of meditation. She saw him, but said nothing, knowing that any direct attention would make him bolt like a deer. He stayed for an hour, utterly still, his focus entirely on the blind mare as she grazed. The mare, whom Elara had simply been calling Mare, seemed to know he was there long before Elara did. Her ears, always in motion, would flick in his direction, register his presence, and then return to their slow sweep of the world. She was not alarmed by him. The boy came back the next day, and the day after that. He never spoke, he just watched. On the 4th day, Elara was brushing the mare's pale coat, which was now sleek and healthy. The boy had crept closer, his bare feet making no sound on the dusty ground. "She looks like a ghost," he whispered. The words were so soft, Elara almost missed them. It was the first time she had heard him speak. Elara paused her brushing. "A ghost?" "Yeah," he said, a little bolder now. "The way she moves through the trees at the edge of the field. Like she can see them, but she can't. And she's the colour of the woods in the fog." He pointed. "Ghostwood." The name was perfect. It fit the mare's ethereal quality, her strange and silent grace. It was a name born of quiet observation. "Ghostwood," Elara repeated. "I like that." From that day on, a silent partnership was formed. Finn became a fixture on the ranch. He'd appear after school, his chores unspoken but understood. He'd fill water buckets, clear stones from the pasture, sit for hours just talking to Ghostwood in a low murmur, telling her about his day, about the hawk that circled overhead, about the shape of the clouds. The mare would stand with her head lowered near him, the soft nose sometimes nudging his shoulder, listening. For a boy no one listened to, a horse that could only listen was the perfect confidant. The seasons turned. Autumn brought a chill to the air and the acrid smell of burning leaves. The cost of hay was high that year, and Elara's ledger was a grim tally of escalating expenses against a dwindling savings account. The arithmetic of survival was becoming harder. She sold her husband's good saddle and his hunting rifle, each sale a small, sharp pain, a letting go of another piece of him. The money went to hay, to salt blocks, to a new blanket for the mare. It was then she made the decision. It was a gamble so profound, so far beyond the logic of her neighbours, that she didn't dare speak it aloud. She was going to breed the mare. Her thinking was a quiet internal calculation. Ghostwood had the conformation, the intelligence, and the temperament. Her blindness was from an injury, a run-in with a barbed wire fence the previous owner had told her about, not a genetic defect. Her bloodlines, which Elara had paid a small fee to trace, were solid, full of the hardy, working cow horses that the valley was built on. She was a vessel of hidden value. She couldn't afford the high stud fees of Thorne's champion stallions. His horses were bred for flash and fire, for the show ring. Elara wasn't looking for flash. She was looking for sense and bone. She spent weeks researching, making quiet calls. She found a stallion on a small ranch 2 counties over. He wasn't a champion, but he was known for throwing calm, intelligent foals with good feet and good minds. His name was Ironwood. The pairing felt right. Ghostwood and Ironwood. The stud fee took the last of her savings, the money she'd set aside for property taxes. It was an act of pure, terrifying faith. When she brought Ghostwood home after the breeding, the mare seemed to carry a new stillness, a sense of purpose. Winter settled in, deep and unforgiving. The valley wrapped itself in snow. The news of Elara's gamble trickled out, passed from the feed store to the post office. The pity the town felt for her curdled into a kind of weary exasperation. Breeding a blind mare. It was no longer a sad story. It was a fool's errand. They imagined a blind foal, a clumsy, useless creature, another mouth to feed, another burden on a woman who already had too many. It was far easier to believe the whole line was rotten than to admit they had misjudged the rootstock. Elara heard the whispers when she went to town. She saw the looks. She banked her hope low, like a coal buried in ash, keeping it warm against the long, cold winter of their doubt. She, Finn, and the mare waited for spring. Spring arrived late, reluctantly. The snow receded, leaving the ground muddy and brown. Ghostwood grew heavy, her movements slow and deliberate. Elara and Finn kept a constant vigil, their days revolving around the mare's impending delivery. Finn had built a small shelter of scrap wood and tarps at the edge of the pasture, so he could be close, sleeping there on the coldest nights. The filly was born during a storm under a sky the colour of slate. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the small barn where Elara had moved the mare. It was a difficult birth. Ghostwood was distressed, unable to see what was happening, relying only on instinct and on the sound of Elara's calm, steady voice. Finn was there, a small, silent shadow, his face pale with worry. He held the lantern, keeping the light steady, his presence a small anchor in the chaos. When the foal finally slid free, she was a miracle, small, slick, and impossibly long-legged. Her coat was dark, the color of wet earth after a rainstorm, but as she dried, it lightened to the gray of her dam sire. She was perfect. Elara's hands, shaking with exhaustion and relief, ran over the foal's body, checking every inch. Strong legs, a deep chest, and wide, intelligent eyes that were clear and bright. The filly struggled to her feet within the hour, a clumsy, determined effort. She found her mother's side, and Ghostwood, who had been nickering softly, anxiously since the birth, fell silent as her foal began to nurse. A deep peace settled over the barn, the only sounds the suckling of the foal and the drumming of the rain on the roof. Finn crept forward, his eyes wide with awe. "She's like an echo," he whispered, "of the storm." And so she was named, Echo. As the weeks turned into months, it became clear that Echo was more than just a healthy foal. She was exceptional, and her upbringing was unlike any other in the valley. While Thorne's foals were raised in manicured paddocks, learning the world from a place of perfect safety, Echo learned it from a mother who navigated by sound and touch. Ghostwood taught her daughter a different language. She taught her to listen. When they walked the pasture, the mare would stop, her ears cocked, and Echo would stop beside her, mirroring the posture, learning to read the snap of a twig, the change in the wind's direction, the subtle shift in the earth under her feet. Ghostwood could not show her the way around a fallen log or a patch of treacherous rocky ground. She taught her to test her footing, to be mindful of every single step. Where other foals would bound ahead heedlessly, Echo moved with a preternatural caution and awareness. Mr. Sorensen's words came back to Elara again and again. A smooth path teaches a horse nothing of its own feet. Echo was learning her feet on the most uneven path of all. Elara knew what she had. The filly was a rare combination of her sire's calm mind and her dam's heightened senses. But she kept the knowledge quiet. She worked with Echo in the far pasture, away from the road, teaching her to lead, to stand, to trust. The filly learned with a speed that was startling. Her success was a secret, a treasure buried in plain sight. The community saw only a woman and a boy playing with a foal in a field. They didn't see the meticulous training, the slow cultivation of a champion. Marcus Thorne saw, though, or he saw enough to be intrigued. He stopped by one day in late summer, his gleaming truck a stark contrast to Elara's dusty lane. He leaned against the fence, exuding an air of casual authority. "Heard the blind mare dropped a filly," he said, his eyes on Echo as she trotted circles around her mother. "Turned out better than expected." The compliment was backhanded, a suggestion that any success was pure luck. "She's healthy," Elara said, her voice level. "Look, Elara," he said, shifting to the tone of a man doing a great favor. "I feel for your situation. I'll give you 500 for the little thing. Cash. It'll help you get through the winter, maybe buy a sensible horse." The arithmetic of insult. He was offering slightly more than the cost of a few months of hay, a price that declared the filly a novelty, not an investment. He wanted to buy her cheap before anyone else noticed her quality. "She's not for sale," Elara said. Thorne's smile tightened. "Don't be sentimental. It's a good offer, more than fair for a foal from that stock." He gestured dismissively at Ghostwood. Elara said nothing. Her silence was a wall he could not breach. He eventually left, annoyed, kicking a stone with the toe of his expensive boot. He came back the following year. Echo was a yearling now, her frame filling out, her movements possessing a fluid power that was impossible to ignore. Thorne's offer this time was $2,000. He framed it as an act of stunning generosity. "The market's soft," he lied, "but I like a project. I'll take her off your hands, give you a fresh start." Again, Elara's reply was the same, a quiet, "No thank you." His condescension was turning to frustration. He couldn't understand her refusal. In his world, everything had a price, and his money was always enough. He could not compute a woman who operated on a different kind of arithmetic, the arithmetic of worth. He drove away faster that day, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the quiet pasture where a filly with iron-hard feet, taught by a blind mother, continued to learn the texture of the world. The third winter was the one that changed everything. It came in with a savage beauty, coating the valley in a thick, perfect layer of ice. A week of freezing rain encased every branch, every fence wire, every blade of grass in crystal. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. The ground beneath the ice became a treacherous mirror. Then, as a slow thaw began, a strange affliction followed. It was a hoof rot, but a virulent and unusual kind. It thrived in the damp, soft ground that emerged from the melt. It started in the biggest, most prosperous ranches, the ones with the most valuable horses. Marcus Thorne's operation was hit hardest. His yearlings and 2-year-olds, the pride of his breeding program, were kept in immaculate stalls, bedded deep in soft shavings. Their hooves were pampered, perfectly trimmed, but they were soft. They had never been challenged by hard, uneven ground. When they were turned out into the thawing, rutted pastures, the rot took hold with terrifying speed. The soft tissue of their hooves, weakened by the constant moisture and unaccustomed to the harsh terrain, became a breeding ground for infection. Horses went lame overnight. The valley's vet was run ragged, driving from one stricken ranch to another. The air of prosperity that always surrounded Thorne's property was replaced by the grim smell of antiseptic and the sight of limping, miserable animals. The smooth path had betrayed them. On Elara's ridge, the story was different. The ice storm had been just as severe, but her land was rockier, the drainage better, and her horses were different. Ghostwood had spent years navigating the world by touch. She moved over the ice with a shuffling, careful gait that kept her upright, and Echo, her student, did the same. She had been raised on that uneven ground. Her hooves, never coddled, were tough as iron. She moved over the frozen, pitted landscape with the same uncanny confidence she always had, her feet finding purchase where other horses found disaster. The rot never touched them. At first, no one noticed. They were too consumed with their own losses. But as winter dragged on and the lameness spread, people started to see. They'd drive past Elara's place and see the dark grey filly trotting soundly across a field that had crippled their own stock. They'd see Finn leading her over ground they wouldn't dare walk themselves, and the filly moved like a dancer. The valley's arithmetic began to shift. The mockery that had followed Elara for 3 years curdled, first into a grudging suspicion. There were whispers that it was unnatural, that the blind mare had some strange magic. It was easier to believe in witchcraft than to believe they had been so profoundly wrong. But suspicions slowly gave way to a dawning, desperate respect. Ranchers started stopping by, their trucks idling in her lane, not with pity anymore, but with a kind of baffled awe. They'd ask what she was feeding her horses, what her secret was. No secret, Elara would say, just hard ground. They would look from the tough, scarred earth of her pasture to the sound, healthy filly, and then back to their own pampered, lame yearlings, and a difficult truth would begin to settle in their minds. They had prized perfection, and it had proven brittle. Elara had salvaged the broken, and it had endured. The value they had assigned to things was wrong. The price they had paid for their prized stock was now the cost of their ruin, while the $50 Elara had spent on a blind mare was beginning to look like the wisest investment in the valley. The annual spring auction approached, and Echo was the only yearling of note in the entire region who was not only sound, but thriving. Elara entered her. It was time. Private offers started coming in. Quiet phone calls from ranchers desperate to bring her filly's hardy bloodline into their devastated herds. Each time, Elara would listen politely and say, "She'll be at the auction. Everyone gets a fair chance." She kept a small notebook, a list of the calls. 3 serious offers in 1 week. 2 days before the auction, Marcus Thorne made one last visit. The veneer of condescending charity was gone. His face was drawn, his eyes hollowed out by stress and sleepless nights. His prize stallion's progeny had been decimated. His reputation was on the line. He got straight to the point.
"I won't be bid against in the public auction, Elara," he said, his voice low and raw.
"It's unseemly. Name your price. I'll pay it." "She'll sell to the highest bidder," Elara said calmly. "That's how an auction works." A flicker of his old arrogance returned. "Don't play games with me. You've got a lucky foal, that's all.
I'll give you $15,000 in cash right now. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat. That's 10 times what she's worth on paper. Elara felt a cold stillness settle over her, the arithmetic of greed, desperate now. She was about to refuse, to simply turn and walk away, when he made his fatal mistake. I know you've had 3 other private offers this week, he said, trying to sound like a man in possession of all the facts. This is more than any of them. I'll beat them all. Elara froze. Her heart gave a single hard thud. Only 2 other people on Earth knew about those 3 calls, her and Finn.
The callers had been circumspect, wanting to keep their interest quiet before the auction. There was no way Thorne could have known. Unless one of them hadn't been a genuine buyer. Unless one of them had been his man, fishing for information, trying to gauge her expectations. He had just revealed that he had spied on her, that he had tried to manipulate her from the shadows. In his desperate attempt to control the outcome, he had betrayed himself. A slow, cold anger rose in her, but her face remained a mask of calm. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Thorne," she said, a voice impossibly level. "I'll consider it." He left, confident he had finally found the number that would make her yield. He did not understand that he had just handed her the only weapon she needed. He thought he was negotiating a price. He had no idea he was about to pay for a lesson. And so she stood by the auction ring, the lead rope to the calm grey filly held loosely in her hand. The bidding had been a fever dream. It had opened at 10,000, a gasp-inducing number, and had climbed relentlessly from there. The local ranchers, humbled by the winter, had pooled their money, trying to keep the filly in the valley. They topped out at 32,000, a heroic, heartbreaking effort. Then it was just Thorne and a determined voice on the phone, a buyer from out of state who clearly knew the filly's story. The numbers climbed, 45, 46, 47. Thorne's bids were sharp, angry barks. The phone bidder was methodical, relentless. The air was electric. Finn stood near the gate, his knuckles white where he gripped the rail, his eyes fixed on Elara. Mr. Sorensen was there too, standing at the back, his arms crossed, watching the drama unfold with a grim satisfaction. 49,000 from Mr. Thorne, the auctioneer shouted. Do I have 49.5? He looked to the clerk on the phone. The man listened for a moment, then shook his head. The phone bidder was out. 49,000 it is, the auctioneer roared, turning his attention to the rest of the silent, stunned room. Going once, going twice. His gaze landed on Thorne, who was already reaching for his checkbook, a look of triumphant fury on his face. He had won. He had proven once again that his money could conquer all. He shot Elara a look that said, "You should have taken my first offer." The gavel was raised. "Sold! Wait!" Elara's voice was not loud, but it cut through the barn like a shard of glass. Every head turned. The auctioneer froze, his gavel in mid-air. "I'm withdrawing the filly from the sale," Elara said, her voice clear and steady. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne's face, which had been alight with victory, contorted into a mask of disbelief and rage. "You can't do that. We have a bid, a contract." "I can," Elara said, looking not at him, but at the auctioneer. The reserve was not met. It was a lie, a beautiful, powerful lie. She had never set a reserve, but in that moment no one doubted her. A furious silence descended. Thorne looked as if he might climb over the rails, but Elara held the room with her stillness. She turned her body slightly to address the assembled ranchers, the men who had mocked her and pitied her, and finally, grudgingly, respected her. "The past winter was hard on everyone," she began. Her voice resonated with a quiet authority she had never before possessed. "Many of you lost good stock.
This valley needs to rebuild, and it needs to rebuild with horses that are strong enough for this land. She then laid out a new kind of arithmetic, the arithmetic of community.
I will not sell Echo to one man, she declared, but I will offer breeding rights for next season to any rancher in this valley whose herd was hurt by the rot. The fee will be $500. A wave of murmurs swept the room. It was a fraction of what a stud fee for a filly of this quality would command. It was a gift. That is the price of rebuilding together, she paused, letting the offer settle. Then her eyes finally found Marcus Thorne. His face was a thundercloud of humiliation. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dropping, becoming personal and precise. You also need to rebuild. And you have always been a man who believes in paying a fair price. She looked around at the faces of the 10 local ranchers she knew had been hit hardest. The breeding fee for 10 of your neighbors comes to $5,000, a fair price for the health of our community. I will sell Echo to you right now for that exact amount. The trap was perfect. It was elegant. It was brutal. She was not just selling him a horse. She was forcing him to fund his rival's recovery. She was making him pay not for the filly, but for his own arrogance. He could refuse, of course. He could storm out. But to do so would be to declare himself an enemy of the entire valley, to abandon the pretense of leadership he had so carefully cultivated. He would be admitting that his pride was worth more than his own future. He was trapped by his own image. The silence in the barn was absolute. Every eye was on Thorne. His jaw worked, his hands clenched and unclenched. He was a man being publicly dismantled, not by force, but by a quiet, unassailable logic. Finally, with a choked, guttural sound, he nodded, a single, sharp jerk of his head. Elara handed the lead rope to Finn, who looked up at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. She walked to the clerk's table, took out a pen, and wrote the bill of sale. Echo, sold to Marcus Thorne, for the price of mending a community. Months later, the late summer sun warmed the ridge. The ranch was transformed. The mortgage was paid off. A new, larger barn stood half-finished, the scent of fresh-cut lumber hanging in the air. Elara had officially become Finn's legal guardian. The boy, who had been a ghost in his own life, now had a home. They were standing with Mr. Sorensen at the fence, watching Ghostwood. The mare, her belly already beginning to swell with another foal, grazed peacefully in the pasture she knew by heart. She was the quiet, constant center of their new world. The accounts of life were finally, improbably, balanced. Elara was no longer a person alone. Sorensen watched the mare for a long time, then turned his gaze to Elara. A rare, small smile touched his weathered face. A smooth path, he said, the words a quiet benediction. It teaches nothing,